Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness change everything. When 8-year-old Aiyana found a dying dog beneath the old cottonwood tree in Cedar Ridge, her heart wouldn't let her walk away. The townspeople told her to leave the starving animal be, but she couldn't ignore his pleading eyes. She brought him water and scraps of food, nursing him back to health day by day. As storm grew stronger, something remarkable happened. He began digging in specific spots around town, as if he knew exactly what lay buried beneath the earth. What he uncovered shocked everyone. Ancient pottery, old coins, and something far more dangerous that had been hidden for decades. The dog seemed to understand secrets that even the oldest residents had forgotten. But how could a rescued stray know where these buried treasures lay hidden? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cedar Ridge as Aiyana walked carefully down the dusty main street, carrying a small bowl of water and yesterday's leftover cornbread wrapped in a clean cloth. The frontier town of 1889 sat like a weathered jewel in the heart of Arizona territory, where the red earth met the endless sky and two worlds existed in uneasy balance. At 8 years old, Aiyana moved with the quiet grace her Apache grandmother had taught her, her dark braids swaying gently as she made her way toward the old cottonwood tree at the edge of town. The massive tree had stood there longer than anyone could remember, its thick trunk scarred by time and weather, its branches reaching toward the heavens like ancient arms in prayer. It was here 3 days ago that she had found him, a dog. So thin his ribs showed through matted fur, his amber eyes holding a depth of suffering that spoke to something deep in her young soul. The townspeople had warned her away from the creature. Probably diseased, Sheriff Garrett had muttered, adjusting his worn leather belt as he watched her approach the animal that first day. Best leave it be, little Apache. Nature will take its course. But Aiyana had seen something in those amber eyes that the sheriff had missed. Not disease, but intelligence, and something else she couldn't quite name. A knowing that seemed older than his years. Her grandmother, Singing Crow, had raised her in the small adobe house on the outskirts of town, where the Apache families had settled after the Troubles years before. The old woman possessed wisdom that seemed to flow from the very earth itself, her weathered hands never idle as she ground corn or wove baskets, her voice soft when she shared the old stories that kept their people's spirit alive in this strange new world. Every creature has a purpose, little star, Singing Crow had told her when Aiyana first mentioned the dying dog. The elderly woman had been preparing her morning tea, steam rising from the clay cup like prayers ascending to the sky. Some purposes we understand right away, others reveal themselves in their own time. She had looked at her granddaughter with eyes that held the depth of decades. But kindness is never wasted, child. It plants seeds in places we cannot see. The dog, whom Aiyana had begun calling Storm in her mind because of the way his fur seemed to ripple like storm clouds, had been too weak that first day to do more than lift his head when she approached. She had knelt beside him in the shade of the cottonwood, speaking softly in Apache, her grandmother's language flowing like water over stones. The words seemed to calm him, and when she offered water from her cupped hands, he had drunk gratefully. Cedar Ridge was a town caught between worlds, much like Aiyana herself. The main street bustled with activity as settlers went about their daily business. Cowboys adjusting their saddles outside Murphy's saloon, wives in long skirts emerging from Henderson's general store with their arms full of supplies, children playing in the dust while their mothers watched with careful eyes. The smell of bread from the bakery mixed with the sharper scents of leather and horse sweat, creating the unique perfume of frontier life. Doc Mitchell's office occupied a small building near the center of town, its wooden sign creaking in the desert breeze. The doctor was a kind man who had always treated the Apache families with respect, unlike some of the other settlers who barely acknowledged their existence. His weathered face bore the lines of someone who had seen both the best and worst of frontier life, and his gentle hands had delivered babies, set broken bones, and closed the eyes of the dying with equal care. Mrs. Henderson ran the general store with efficient precision, her graying hair always pulled back in a neat bun, her apron spotless despite the dusty conditions. She had never been unkind to Aiyana, but there was a reserve in her manner, a careful distance that spoke of the invisible lines drawn between the two communities. The schoolhouse sat at the far end of town, a simple wooden structure where the settler children learned their letters and numbers. Aiyana had never attended. Apache children were not welcome there, but she had learned to read from her grandmother, who had been taught by the missionary's wife years before. Books were precious, things in their small home, each one treated with reverence. As Aiyana knelt beside Storm on this third morning, she noticed the change immediately. His breathing was stronger, his eyes more alert. The water and food she had brought had begun their healing work. Though he was still painfully thin, she unwrapped the cornbread, breaking it into small pieces and placing them within his reach. "Good morning, Storm," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle rustle of cottonwood leaves. "You're looking better today." The dog turned his amber gaze toward her, and for a moment, Aiyana felt something pass between them. A connection that went beyond the simple bond between child and animal. There was recognition in those eyes, and something else that made her heart skip. It was as if he understood not just her words, but the intention behind them, the hope and care she carried in her young heart. As Storm ate, Aiyana noticed something peculiar. His attention kept drifting to a spot near the base of the cottonwood tree, his ears perking up as if he heard something she could not. Several times he moved his head in a particular direction, his nose twitching as if catching a scent that intrigued him. "What is it, boy?" she asked softly, following his gaze. The ground there looked no different from anywhere else, packed earth scattered with fallen leaves and the occasional tumbleweed. But Storm's interest was unmistakable. When she returned home that afternoon, she found her grandmother sitting in her favorite chair on the small porch, her fingers working steadily on a basket woven from willow branches. The old woman looked up as Aiyana approached, her dark eyes reading her granddaughter's face with the skill of decades. "The dog is stronger," Singing Crow observed, not really asking. "Yes, grandmother, but he does something strange. He keeps looking at the ground as if he knows something is there." The elderly woman's fingers paused for just a moment in their weaving before resuming their rhythm. "Animals see what we have forgotten how to see, little star. Their spirits are closer to the earth, less cluttered by the thoughts that blind us to truth." That evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of orange and purple, Aiyana sat with her grandmother outside their small home, listening to the sounds of the desert settling into night. Coyotes called to each other in the distance, their voices weaving together in an ancient song, while the last birds of day gave way to the first creatures of darkness. "Grandmother," Aiyana said carefully, "do you think some animals are different from others? Special, maybe?" Singing Crow was quiet for a long time, her gaze fixed on the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of old knowledge. "There are stories, passed down from grandmother to granddaughter, about spirit animals who come to help when the world has forgotten important truths. They appear when something needs to be remembered or when justice has been buried too deep." She looked at her granddaughter with serious eyes. "But these are just old stories, child, the kind we tell around fires when the night is cold, and we need to remember who we are." As Aiyana lay in her small bed that night, listening to her grandmother's gentle breathing in the next room, she thought about Storm's strange behavior. Something in her heart told her that the dog's recovery was just the beginning of something much larger, something that would change not just her life, but the life of their entire town. Outside, the cottonwood tree stood sentinel in the moonlight, its branches moving gently in the night breeze. and somewhere beneath its ancient roots, secrets waited in the darkness, patient as the earth itself, ready to be discovered by a rescued dog who somehow knew exactly where to look. The bond between girl and dog was growing stronger with each passing day, built on foundation of kindness and watered with compassion. But neither Aiyana nor the people of Cedar Ridge understood yet that Storm's presence would soon uncover truths that had been buried for 15 years, truths that would force an entire community to confront the shadows of their past and choose between comfortable lies and painful justice. The morning would bring new discoveries, and with them the first glimpse of the mystery that would transform them all. The fourth morning brought a change that would alter the course of everything. Storm was standing when Aiyana arrived at the cottonwood tree, his strength clearly returning, though his frame remained gaunt from weeks of starvation. But it wasn't his improved condition that stopped her in her tracks. It was his behavior. The dog was pawing frantically at the base of the great tree, his claws scratching at the packed earth with an urgency that seemed almost desperate. Dirt flew behind him as he dug, his entire body focused on this single task, as if his life depended on it. "Storm, what are you doing?" Aiyana asked, kneeling beside him. But the dog barely acknowledged her presence, continuing his excavation with single-minded determination. She tried to coax him away with the food she had brought, but for the first time since she had begun caring for him, Storm ignored the offering. Whatever lay beneath the earth called to him more strongly than hunger itself. Curious now, Aiyana began helping him dig. The soil was hard-packed from years of foot traffic, but gradually they made progress. Her small hands worked alongside his paws, both of them driven by something they couldn't name. Then her fingers touched something smooth and hard. Carefully she brushed away the remaining dirt, revealing what lay beneath. An obsidian arrowhead, perfectly crafted and gleaming black as midnight, emerged from its earthen tomb. But it wasn't alone. As they continued digging, more objects appeared. Fragments of pottery decorated with ancient designs, and then something that made Aiyana's breath catch in her throat. Bones. Human bones, yellowed with age, but unmistakably real. She pulled her hands back, heart racing. But Storm continued digging around the remains with reverent care, as if he understood the sacred nature of what they had uncovered. More bones appeared, along with scraps of what had once been clothing, now reduced to tatters by time and earth. "We need to stop," Aiyana whispered, but Storm looked at her with those amber eyes, and she saw something in them that stilled her protest. This wasn't random destruction. This was revelation. By the time they finished, they had uncovered what was clearly a burial site. The bones were arranged in the traditional Apache manner, suggesting this had once been a proper grave. But something was wrong. The location was all wrong for an Apache burial ground, and the artifacts scattered around the remains told a story that chilled Aiyana's heart. The obsidian arrowhead bore the distinctive craftsmanship of her people, but it was broken, snapped in half, as if in violence. The pottery fragments showed signs of being smashed, not simply broken by time. And there were other things. Brass buttons that looked like they came from cavalry uniforms, spent bullet casings tarnished with age. The sound of approaching footsteps made Aiyana look up. Sheriff Garrett was striding toward them, his face dark with irritation. "What in tarnation are you doing out here, girl?" he demanded, then stopped short when he saw what they had unearthed. His weathered face went pale. Sweet Mary and Joseph, word spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire. Within an hour, half the town had gathered around the cottonwood tree, staring in shock at the excavated remains. The crowd formed a loose circle, voices rising in excited speculation and fear. "Whose bones are they?" someone called out. "How long have they been there?" asked another. Doc Mitchell pushed through the crowd, his medical bag in hand. He knelt beside the remains, his experienced eyes taking in the scene with professional detachment that quickly gave way to something deeper. When he looked up, his face was grave. "These bones have been here a long time," he announced to the crowd. 15 years, maybe more. And this wasn't a natural death. He pointed to marks on the ribs, signs that Aiyana couldn't interpret, but that made the doctor's expression darken further. The crowd's excited chatter died to whispers, then to an uncomfortable silence. Aiyana noticed how the townspeople began looking at each other with suspicious eyes, how conversations stopped mid-sentence when certain people approached. Mrs. Henderson clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "We should just rebury them and forget this ever happened," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. "Some things are better left alone." "Can't do that, Martha," Doc Mitchell replied firmly. "These remains deserve proper investigation. Someone was killed and buried in secret. That's not something we can just ignore." But Sheriff Garrett stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun belt, in a gesture that wasn't quite threatening, but wasn't entirely casual either. "Doc's right that this needs looking into," he said slowly, his eyes scanning the crowd. "But it needs to be done proper-like, official, and until then, I don't want anyone else disturbing this site." His gaze settled on Aiyana with unmistakable warning. "That includes you, little Apache. This dog of yours has stirred up enough trouble for one day." The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, but Aiyana caught fragments of whispered conversations as people walked away. "Always knew something was off about that year. Remember when the Patterson family left, so sudden-like? My husband never did explain why he came home with blood on his shirt that night." The words sent chills down Aiyana's spine. There was fear in those voices, and guilt, and something that felt like shame passed down through years of silence. As the townspeople drifted back toward their homes and businesses, Storm sat quietly beside the disturbed grave, his amber eyes watchful and alert. He showed no interest in leaving, as if he understood his job wasn't finished. That evening, Aiyana sat with her grandmother on their small porch, the day's discoveries weighing heavily on her young mind. She had told Singing Crow everything about Storm's behavior, the excavation, the bones and artifacts they had found. The elderly woman listened in silence, her weathered hands still as she processed her granddaughter's words. When Aiyana finished speaking, Singing Crow was quiet for a long time, her gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "Grandmother," Aiyana finally asked, "do you know whose bones those were?" Singing Crow closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they held depths of sorrow that spoke of old wounds never properly healed. "There are things, little star, that happened before you were born, things that good people agreed to forget, because remembering was too painful." She reached out and took Aiyana's small hand in her own. "But the earth remembers everything, and sometimes, when the time is right, it sends messengers to make sure the truth doesn't stay buried forever." "Storm is a messenger, I think," Singing Crow said carefully, "that your Storm is more than just a dog you saved. I think he has been waiting a long time for someone with a heart brave enough to help him complete an important task." That night, Aiyana lay awake listening to the sounds of the desert. But tonight, the familiar chorus of coyotes and nightbirds seemed different, charged with significance she was only beginning to understand. Through her small window, she could see the cottonwood tree in the distance, its branches moving gently. In the night breeze, somewhere in the darkness, Storm was keeping vigil over the disturbed grave, his amber eyes reflecting the starlight as he watched and waited. Tomorrow would bring new questions, new fears, and new resistance from people who had spent 15 years believing that some secrets were safer left buried. But the truth, once awakened, has a power all its own. And Storm, it seemed, was just getting started. The discovery of the bones cast a shadow over Cedar Ridge that seemed to deepen with each passing day. Sheriff Garrett had posted notices around town declaring the cottonwood tree area off-limits, but his authority couldn't silence the whispered conversations that followed Aiyana wherever she went. Despite the official prohibition, Aiyana found herself drawn back to the tree each morning. Storm was always there, waiting, as if he had never left. The dog had grown stronger in the past week, his coat beginning to show hints of its former luster, but his attention remained focused on the ground with undiminished intensity. On the 5th morning after the discovery, Storm led her away from the cottonwood for the first time. He moved with purpose, his nose to the ground, following some scent or instinct that only he could perceive. Aiyana followed, her heart beating faster as they made their way toward the old mill at the edge of town. The mill had been abandoned for years, its wooden water wheel frozen with rust and neglect. Weeds grew tall around its foundation, and the building itself leaned slightly, as if tired of standing against time and weather. It was here that Storm stopped, pausing at a spot near the mill's stone foundation, where the earth looked softer than the surrounding ground. "Not again," Aiyana whispered, but even as she spoke, she was already kneeling beside him, her hands joining his paws in the now familiar ritual of excavation. This time, the digging was easier. The soil here was looser, less compacted than the area beneath the cottonwood. Within minutes, Storm's claws scraped against something metallic. Aiyana's fingers found the object first, a silver locket, tarnished with age, but still beautiful, its surface engraved with delicate flowers. With trembling hands, she opened the locket. Inside was a photograph, faded but still clear enough to make out two faces, a young white woman with kind eyes and gentle smile, and beside her an Apache man in traditional dress, his expression serious but warm. "Oh," Aiyana breathed, studying the photograph with wide eyes. The woman was beautiful, with light hair swept back in the fashion of 15 years past. The Apache man wore a medicine bag around his neck and feathers in his hair, marking him as someone of importance among his people. Storm continued digging around the locket's resting place, and soon more artifacts appeared. A broken comb, its teeth scattered in the dirt. A few buttons, one bearing traces of blue fabric still clinging to it. And beneath it all, more bones, smaller this time, more delicate but unmistakably human. The sound of approaching footsteps made Aiyana look up in alarm. Doc Mitchell was walking toward them, his medical bag in one hand and a troubled expression on his weathered face. "I thought I might find you here," he said quietly, settling his considerable bulk down beside the excavation with a grunt. "Storm's been making quite a reputation for himself as a digger." Doc Mitchell's eyes fell on the locket in Aiyana's hands, and she saw something change in his expression: surprise, recognition, and then a deep, crushing sorrow. "May I see that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Aiyana handed him the locket, watching as the doctor's hands trembled slightly while he examined the photograph. When he looked up, tears were streaming down his cheeks. "That's my sister Catherine," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She disappeared 15 years ago. We searched for weeks, months even. Sheriff said she must have run off, maybe eloped with some traveling man." He looked down at the bones Storm had uncovered. "But she's been here all along." The doctor's revelation hit Aiyana like a physical blow. This wasn't just another mysterious burial. This was someone's sister, someone's daughter, someone who had been loved and mourned and searched for. "Doc," she said carefully, "who is the man in the photograph with her?" Doc Mitchell wiped his eyes with the back of his hand before answering. "That would be Joseph Crow Wing. He was a medicine man among your people, Aiyana. A good man, respected by both Apache and settlers alike. He and Catherine—" He paused, struggling with the words. "They were in love, planning to marry, despite what some folks thought about such unions." The pieces began to fall into place in Aiyana's mind. A white woman and Apache man planning to marry 15 years ago would have faced enormous opposition from both communities. But to kill them for it, they were murdered, she said, the words coming out as a statement rather than a question. Doc Mitchell nodded grimly. "I'm beginning to think so. Catherine wrote to me just before she disappeared, telling me about her plans to marry Joseph. She was happy, excited about her future. She wouldn't have just run away." Storm had continued digging while they talked, and now he sat back on his haunches, his work apparently complete. The grave they had uncovered was smaller than the first. one. But the evidence of violence was just as clear. Broken bones, scattered artifacts, and the hasty nature of the burial all spoke of death that came suddenly and was hidden quickly. "We need to tell Sheriff Garrett about this," Doc Mitchell said, though his voice carried little enthusiasm for the prospect. "Will he listen?" Aiyana asked. He seemed pretty determined to keep people away from the first grave. The doctor was quiet for a long moment, studying the remains of his sister with eyes that held both grief and growing anger. "I don't think Tom Garrett wants these graves found, child. I think he knows more than he's letting on about what happened 15 years ago." That afternoon, despite Doc Mitchell's reservations, they reported the second discovery to the sheriff. Garrett's reaction was immediate and intense. His face flushed red with anger, and his hand moved instinctively to his gun. "This has got to stop," he declared, his voice rising loud enough to draw attention from passers-by on the main street. "That dog is nothing but trouble, and I won't have him disturbing the peace of our town anymore." "Tom," Doc Mitchell said carefully, "this is my sister we're talking about. Catherine deserves justice." "Your sister ran off 15 years ago," Garrett replied coldly. "Whatever bones that mongrel is digging up, they're not connected to Catherine Mitchell. Now I want that dog removed from town, and I want those holes filled in and forgotten." But Doc Mitchell stood his ground, his medical authority lending weight to his words. "I'm the doctor in this town, Tom, and I'm telling you those are human remains that deserve proper investigation. You can't just order them buried again." The confrontation ended in stalemate, but Aiyana could see the fear in Sheriff Garrett's eyes. He was afraid of what Storm might find next, afraid of what truths might emerge from the Arizona earth. That evening, as she sat with her grandmother, Aiyana shared the day's discoveries and the doctor's revelations. Singing Crow listened with the same careful attention she had shown before, but this time her reaction was different. "Joseph Crow Wing," the elderly woman repeated, her voice soft with memory. "I knew him. He was a gifted healer, a bridge builder between our peoples. His disappearance was a great loss to all of us. Grandmother, do you think Storm is connected to Joseph somehow?" Singing Crow looked toward the cottonwood tree, visible in the distance through their small window. "I think, little star, that your Storm carries the spirit of someone who loved Joseph very much, someone who has been waiting 15 years for the truth to come to light." The implications of her grandmother's words settled over Aiyana like a blanket, both comforting and frightening. Storm wasn't just a rescued dog. He was a messenger from the past, carrying unfinished business that would not rest until justice was served. 3 nights later, Aiyana discovered something that changed everything she thought she knew about Storm's behavior. Unable to sleep, she had slipped from her bed and made her way to the small window that faced the cottonwood tree. The moon was full, casting silver light across the desert landscape, and there in that ethereal glow she saw Storm. The dog was digging again, but this time his movements seemed different, more deliberate, almost ritualistic. As she watched, fascinated, she realized he was working in a perfect circle around a new area, his actions guided by something beyond mere instinct. By morning, Storm had completed his nocturnal excavation. When Aiyana arrived at the tree, she found him sitting calmly beside a third site, his amber eyes reflecting satisfaction and something that looked remarkably like expectation. This dig yielded different artifacts than the previous 2. Among the bones, which appeared to belong to a young man, based on their size and structure, Aiyana found brass buttons bearing the unmistakable eagle insignia of the U.S. Cavalry. But these weren't the well-preserved buttons of a dress uniform. They were scorched, damaged, as if they had been through fire. More disturbing were the other items scattered throughout the grave. Arrowheads, but not Apache ones. These were crude, hastily made, the kind that might be crafted quickly during conflict. And there were bullet casings, dozens of them, suggesting not a single shooting but a sustained battle. "This doesn't make sense," Aiyana murmured, studying the artifacts. If this was a cavalry soldier, what was he doing buried in secret alongside Apache artifacts? And why were all these graves here, in this seemingly random spot beneath the cottonwood? Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. An elderly Apache man approached, walking with the measured dignity of advanced age, but with eyes that were still sharp and aware. Aiyana recognized him immediately. Chief Standing Bear, one of the most respected elders of their community. "Little daughter," he said in Apache, his voice carrying the weight of years and wisdom, "I have been watching what your four-legged friend has been revealing." Standing Bear knelt beside the grave, his weathered hands hovering over the artifacts without touching them. When he spoke again, his words carried the gravity of someone sharing long-held secrets. 15 years ago, there was trouble, big trouble. White soldiers came with papers saying our people had broken the treaty. They said we had stolen cattle, attacked settlers. It was not true, but they came anyway, looking for reasons to drive us from our land. The old chief's eyes grew distant, remembering. There was a young soldier, different from the others. He spoke some of our language, treated our people with respect. When he learned what his commanding officer planned to do, the massacre they intended to cover up as a battle, he tried to warn us. Aiyana felt her heart racing as the implications became clear. This soldier tried to help you? He did more than try. He rode through the night to reach our camp, telling us to flee, to scatter into the desert until the danger passed. Many lives were saved because of his warning. Standing Bear's expression darkened, but his commanding officer discovered the betrayal. The young soldier died for his kindness. The pieces were beginning to form a terrible picture in Aiyana's mind. And Joseph Crow Wing, Catherine Mitchell, they were the ones who brought the soldier's warning to our people. Joseph knew the soldier, had met him during the peace talks. When the soldier was discovered and killed, Joseph and the white woman knew too much. They became targets as well. Standing Bear rose slowly, his joints protesting the movement. For 15 years, we have kept silent about what happened. The army covered up their crime, and the town agreed to forget. It was easier than facing the truth. But why is Storm finding these graves now? Aiyana asked. The old chief looked at the dog, who had been sitting quietly throughout their conversation, almost as if he understood every word being spoken. Some spirits cannot rest when justice remains undone, Standing Bear said simply. I believe your Storm carries the spirit of another dog, one who belonged to the young soldier. That dog witnessed everything, the betrayal, the murders, the hasty burials. He has been waiting for someone with the courage to uncover the truth. That afternoon, Sheriff Garrett arrived at the cottonwood tree with 2 other men Aiyana didn't recognize. They wore the dusty clothes of ranch hands, but something in their manner suggested they were more accustomed to violence than cattle herding. This ends now, Garrett declared, his voice carrying new authority and barely controlled anger. I'm tired of this disturbance to our peaceful community. That dog is a menace, and I want it destroyed. You can't kill him, Aiyana said, stepping protectively in front of Storm. He hasn't done anything wrong. He's disturbing graves, creating unrest, making people afraid to walk the streets, Garrett replied. That's enough wrong for me. But Doc Mitchell appeared, having apparently been watching from his office. Tom, you're out of line. That dog hasn't threatened anyone. All he's done is dig up evidence of crimes that happened 15 years ago. Alleged crimes, Garrett corrected quickly. There's no proof those bones are connected to anything criminal. Could be old Indian burials, could be anything. With cavalry buttons and bullet casings, Doc Mitchell's voice rose. Tom, my sister is among those bones, and I want answers. The confrontation escalated quickly, voices rising as more townspeople gathered to watch. Aiyana noticed how the crowd seemed divided. Some supporting the sheriff's desire to end the excavations, others clearly troubled by the discoveries and wanting answers. Mrs. Henderson clutched her shawl tighter. Maybe we should let sleeping dogs lie, she said, but her voice carried uncertainty. Easy to say when it's not your family in those graves, Doc Mitchell replied sharply. As the argument continued, Aiyana noticed Storm's behavior becoming increasingly agitated. The dog's ears were laid back, his body tense, and his attention was focused not on the arguing humans, but on something in the distance. Following his gaze, she saw riders approaching Cedar Ridge. 3 men on horseback, wearing the clean uniforms and official bearing of federal marshals. Their arrival silenced the crowd immediately. The lead marshal, a tall man with graying temples and serious eyes, dismounted and approached the group. "I'm Marshal Davidson, Territorial Authority. We've received reports about discovered remains. In this area, I'm here to conduct an official investigation." Sheriff Garrett's face went pale. "Marshal, there's no need for federal involvement. This is just a local matter, some old bones that got dug up by accident. 3 separate grave sites containing evidence of violence don't constitute accidents, Sheriff," Marshal Davidson replied, coolly. "Especially when one of them contains the remains of a federal cavalry soldier." The marshal's words hit the crowd like thunder. A federal soldier meant federal jurisdiction, federal investigation, and federal justice. The comfortable conspiracy of silence that had protected Cedar Ridge for 15 years was about to be shattered by the authority of law that couldn't be intimidated or bought. As the crowd began to disperse under the marshal's stern gaze, Aiyana looked down at Storm. The dog was calmer now, as if sensing that help had arrived, but his amber eyes held new intensity, as if he understood that the real work was just beginning. Marshal Davidson's investigation began immediately, and with it came a level of scrutiny that made Sheriff Garrett increasingly nervous. The federal officer established his temporary headquarters in Doc Mitchell's office, spreading maps and documents across every available surface while conducting interviews with townspeople who might remember events from 15 years past. On the 3rd day of the marshal's presence, Storm led Aiyana to yet another location, this time to the ruins of what had once been an Apache camp on the outskirts of town. The area had been abandoned for years, its traditional dwellings long since reduced to scattered stones and overgrown foundations. Here, Storm's digging revealed something that changed everything. Fragments of an official document, partially burned, but still bearing the unmistakable seal of the United States government. The papers were treaties, land agreements, and correspondence, all bearing dates from 15 years earlier. Aiyana carefully gathered the fragments, her young hands trembling as she realized their significance. These weren't just any government papers. They contained evidence of broken promises, forged signatures, and deliberate deception regarding Apache land rights. When she brought the documents to Marshal Davidson, his weathered face grew grave, as he examined each piece with the careful attention of someone who understood their implications. "Where exactly did you find these?" he asked, his voice sharp with professional interest. Aiyana pointed toward the old camp ruins. "Storm, my dog, he led me there. He seems to know where things are buried." Doc Mitchell, who had been watching the examination, leaned forward to get a better look. "Marshal, what do those papers mean?" "They mean that someone tried very hard to destroy evidence of federal crimes," Davidson replied grimly. "These treaty fragments show deliberate falsification of agreements with the Apache Nation. Someone altered land boundaries, forged signatures, and created false justifications for military action." He held up one partially burned document, squinting at the faded text. "This appears to be correspondence between local officials and military commanders, discussing plans to relocate the Apache from valuable land. But look here," he pointed to a section where different ink was clearly visible. "These signatures have been added after the fact." The implications hit Doc Mitchell like a physical blow. "You're saying the whole conflict 15 years ago was manufactured?" "That's exactly what I'm saying. And whoever orchestrated this conspiracy was willing to kill to protect it." Davidson's eyes hardened, including killing one of their own soldiers who discovered the truth. That evening, Doc Mitchell made a decision that would change the course of the investigation. He invited Aiyana and her grandmother to dinner, along with Chief Standing Bear. As they sat around his modest table, sharing a simple meal, the doctor revealed information he had kept hidden for 15 years. "The night my sister disappeared," he began, his voice heavy with long-carried guilt. "She came to me with documents. Papers, she said, would prove that the Apache people were being cheated out of their rightful land. She was terrified, said that powerful men were involved and that Joseph Crow Wing was in danger for helping her." Singing Crow listened intently, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "What did you do with these papers?" Doc Mitchell's face flushed with shame. "I was scared. I told her to destroy them, to forget what she had seen. I thought I was protecting her." His voice broke. "Instead, I sent her to her death." Chief Standing Bear reached across the table and placed a comforting hand on the doctor's shoulder. "You could not have known what evil men were capable of, my friend. The fault lies with those who chose violence over justice. But there's more," Doc Mitchell continued. "After Catherine disappeared, Sheriff Garrett came to me. He said he knew I'd been talking to her about the documents. He warned me that asking too many questions about her disappearance would be dangerous for my health." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Sheriff Garrett hadn't just failed to investigate Catherine's disappearance, he had actively worked to cover it up. "Tom Garrett was part of the conspiracy," Aiyana said, the words coming out as barely a whisper. "I believe so," Doc Mitchell replied, "and I think there are others in town who know the truth but have been too afraid to speak." The next morning brought a development that no one had expected. Mrs. Henderson appeared at Doc Mitchell's office, her usual composure cracked by obvious distress. In her hands, she carried a small wooden box that she set carefully on the doctor's desk. "I can't carry this burden anymore," she said, her voice shaking. "Not with federal marshals asking questions and that dog digging up the past." Inside the box were more documents. Receipts, correspondence, and most damning of all, a detailed accounting ledger showing payments made to various townspeople in the weeks following the massacre. The amounts were substantial, enough to buy silence and complicity from an entire community. "My late husband was the town clerk 15 years ago," Mrs. Henderson explained, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He kept records of everything, including things he probably shouldn't have. After he died, I found this box hidden in our attic." Marshal Davidson studied the ledger with growing amazement. "This shows systematic payment to witnesses, officials, even some Apache families. Someone had access to significant funds and used them to buy an entire town's silence." "Who signed these payment authorizations?" Doc Mitchell asked. Davidson pointed to a signature at the bottom of several documents. "Someone calling himself T.W. Garrett, administrator." He looked up sharply. "Your sheriff's been involved in this from the beginning." The revelation sent shockwaves through the small group, but it also brought a sense of relief to Mrs. Henderson. "There are others who know pieces of the truth," she said. "People who have been living with guilt for 15 years. Maybe now they'll find the courage to speak." She was right. Over the next 2 days, as word of the federal investigation spread, more townspeople came forward with fragments of the story. A former stable hand revealed that he had been paid to dispose of 3 horses on the night of the murders. A seamstress admitted to burning blood-stained clothes brought to her by Sheriff Garrett. Even the town's pastor confessed to conducting secret burial services for unnamed travelers at the sheriff's request. Each revelation added another piece to the puzzle, painting a picture of a conspiracy that reached far beyond simple murder. This had been a calculated effort to steal Apache land through manufactured conflict, with the deaths of Catherine Mitchell, Joseph Crow Wing, and the young cavalry soldier serving as necessary sacrifices to protect the larger scheme. But the most significant revelation came from Chief Standing Bear, who finally decided to break 15 years of forced silence. In a private meeting with Marshal Davidson, the elderly chief revealed the true scope of what had happened. "It was not just about the land beneath the Apache camp," he said, his voice heavy with long-suppressed grief. "There were surveys, secret, ones showing valuable minerals in the earth. Silver, copper, maybe more. The conspiracy was not just to move us, it was to claim the riches beneath our feet. The mineral surveys, when Davidson finally located them in the territorial records, confirmed Standing Bear's account. The Apache Reservation sat atop one of the richest silver deposits in the territory, a fact that had been discovered shortly before the manufactured conflict. As the investigation deepened, Sheriff Garrett became increasingly desperate. He began making veiled threats against those who had come forward with testimony, and his behavior grew erratic enough that Marshal Davidson placed him under official surveillance. But it was Storm who provided the final piece of evidence they needed. On the 7th day of the federal investigation, the dog led Aiyana to one more burial site, this one located directly beneath the sheriff's office itself. Here, buried in a shallow grave beneath the floorboards, they found the personal effects of the murdered cavalry soldier, including his military identification papers and a detailed journal documenting his discovery of the conspiracy and his attempts to warn the Apache people. The journal's final entry, written in a hurried hand, named Sheriff Garrett as one of the principal conspirators and provided a detailed account of the planned massacre. It was signed by Lieutenant William Morrison, U.S. 7th Cavalry, the same man whose bones Storm had helped uncover beneath the cottonwood tree. With this evidence in hand, Marshal Davidson finally had everything he needed to bring the conspirators to justice. But as he prepared to make arrests, Sheriff Garrett made one final desperate attempt to silence the truth forever. The morning that would change everything began with Singing Crow teaching Aiyana about the old ways. They sat together on the small porch of their adobe home, watching the sun paint the desert in shades of gold and orange, while the elderly woman shared knowledge passed down through generations. "There are times, little star, when the spirits of those who have passed cannot rest," Singing Crow said, her weathered hands working steadily on a beadwork pattern that seemed to hold deeper meaning than mere decoration. "They remain connected to this world when great injustices go unpunished, when truth remains buried with their bones." Aiyana listened intently, her young mind trying to grasp concepts that seemed both ancient and immediate. Is that what Storm is? A spirit? Storm carries the spirit of another dog, one who witnessed terrible things and has been waiting for someone with the courage to help him complete his mission. Singing Crow's eyes grew distant with memory. "I knew that dog, child. His name was Thunderwalker, and he belonged to a young Apache warrior who died trying to protect our people." The revelation sent chills down Aiyana's spine. Thunderwalker is inside Storm. Their spirits have joined for this purpose. When you rescued Storm from beneath the cottonwood tree, you weren't just saving a dying animal, you were accepting a sacred responsibility to help the dead find peace. As if summoned by their conversation, Storm appeared at the edge of their small property, but something was different about him today. The dog's amber eyes held a new intensity, and around his neck, previously hidden by his thick fur, Aiyana could now clearly see a leather cord bearing a small turquoise pendant, Apache in design and clearly very old. "Grandmother," Aiyana whispered, pointing to the necklace, "was that always there?" Singing Crow smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "That belonged to Thunderwalker. It was a gift from the warrior who loved him, blessed by our medicine. Man to protect him in both this world and the next." The sacred nature of what she was witnessing hit Aiyana like a revelation. This wasn't just about solving old murders or exposing conspiracies. This was about spiritual justice, about helping souls find peace after 15 years of restless waiting. That afternoon, Marshal Davidson made his move to arrest Sheriff Garrett, but the corrupt lawman had anticipated this development. When Davidson and his deputies arrived at the sheriff's office, they found it empty, the official records gone, and clear evidence that Garrett had fled during the night. "He's had 3 days to prepare for this," Davidson told Doc Mitchell grimly. "Could be anywhere by now, probably with enough stolen money to disappear permanently." But Storm had other ideas. The dog appeared at the marshal's side, his behavior urgent and insistent. He led them not toward the outskirts of town, where a fleeing man might head, but toward the center of Cedar Ridge, to the old abandoned mine shaft that had been boarded up for years. "Why would Garrett go there?" one of the deputies asked, but Davidson was already beginning to understand. "Because that's where the silver is," the marshal replied, pieces falling into place. The mine wasn't abandoned, it was closed to hide. The illegal extraction operation. Garrett's been running a secret mining operation for 15 years, using stolen Apache land to make himself rich. The mine entrance had been hastily reopened, the old boards pulled aside and scattered on the ground. Fresh tracks in the dust showed that several men had entered recently, along with pack animals loaded with supplies. "He's not running," Davidson realized with growing alarm. "He's making a final grab for as much silver as he can carry. And if he's desperate enough, he might be willing to cause a mine collapse to cover his tracks permanently." Inside the mine, the evidence of 15 years of illegal operation was overwhelming. Support beams showed recent work. Tools lay scattered about, and most telling of all, silver ore was stacked in neat piles awaiting transport. This wasn't just a cover-up of old crimes. This was an ongoing criminal enterprise that had been operating under everyone's noses for years. Storm led them deeper into the mine, his supernatural senses guiding them through passages that twisted and branched like an underground maze. The air grew colder and more oppressive with each step, and the sound of voices echoing from ahead confirmed that they were getting close to their quarry. When they finally cornered Garrett and his accomplices in the deepest chamber of the mine, the corrupt sheriff had clearly been preparing for this confrontation. He and 3 other men were armed and positioned behind makeshift barricades of silver ore and mining equipment. "Tom Garrett," Davidson called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and federal crimes against the Apache Nation. Surrender peacefully and no one else needs to get hurt." Garrett's response was a harsh laugh that held no humor. "You think I'm going to hang for protecting this town's interests? Those Indians were sitting on a fortune, doing nothing with it. We put it to good use, created jobs, brought prosperity to Cedar Ridge. You murdered innocent people," Davidson replied, his voice hard with righteous anger, "including your own fellow citizens and a federal soldier." "Casualties of progress," Garrett said coldly. "Catherine Mitchell should have minded her own business instead of helping those savages. And that soldier was a traitor to his own kind." The callous dismissal of human life revealed the true nature of the man they were facing. Garrett wasn't just corrupt. He was a sociopath who saw other people as obstacles to be removed rather than human beings deserving of life and dignity. But it was Storm who provided the resolution to the standoff. The dog suddenly bolted forward, moving with supernatural speed and purpose. Instead of attacking Garrett directly, he raced to a specific spot on the mine wall and began pawing frantically at the stone. The sound that emerged from behind the wall was like nothing any of them had ever heard, a low, rhythmic drumming that seemed to come from the earth itself. The Apache among them recognized it immediately as the sound of traditional drums calling the spirits home. Garrett's accomplices broke first, their nerve failing as the supernatural sounds filled the mine. They threw down their weapons and surrendered, preferring federal justice to whatever spiritual forces were manifesting around them. But Garrett himself seemed transfixed by the drumming, his eyes wide with terror as he stared at the wall where Storm continued his frantic digging. When the dog finally broke through, revealing a hidden chamber beyond, the drumming stopped abruptly, replaced by something even more unsettling, the sound of voices speaking in Apache, welcoming someone home. In that moment, everyone present could see them, the spirits of those who had been murdered 15 years ago, standing in the hidden chamber with expressions of peace and satisfaction. Joseph Crow-Wing stood tall and proud in his traditional dress, Catherine Mitchell beside him with her gentle smile restored, and behind them, Lieutenant Morrison in his cavalry uniform, finally able to rest knowing the truth had been revealed. The spiritual manifestation lasted only seconds, but it was enough. Tom Garrett, faced with the consequences of his crimes not just in this world but in the next, finally surrendered his weapon and accepted his fate. The arrest of Sheriff Garrett should have been the end of the story, but Storm's behavior in the days that followed suggested otherwise. The dog seemed restless, agitated, as if his mission remained incomplete despite the capture of the primary conspirators. He continued to dig, but now his excavations were different, more systematic, more purposeful, as if he were searching for something specific rather than simply revealing buried secrets. It was Doc Mitchell who first noticed the pattern. "Look at this," he said, spreading a map of Cedar Ridge across Marshal Davidson's temporary desk. He had marked each location where Storm had made his discoveries, and when connected, they formed a perfect circle around the town's center. "He's not digging randomly. There's a design to this." Marshal Davidson studied the map with growing interest. "What's at the center of this circle?" "The courthouse," Doc Mitchell replied, "the seat of legal authority for the entire district." But when they investigated the courthouse basement, they found something that changed everything they thought they knew about the conspiracy. Hidden behind a false wall in the building's foundation was a cache of documents that revealed the true scope of the criminal enterprise. The papers weren't just local records. They were correspondence with territorial officials, federal bureaucrats, and mining company executives from back east. The conspiracy hadn't been limited to Cedar Ridge or even to Arizona territory. It was part of a systematic effort to defraud Native American tribes across the entire Southwest, stealing mineral-rich lands through manufactured conflicts and forged treaties. "Sweet Mary," Davidson breathed, reading through document after document. "This goes all the way to Washington. Senators, congressmen, cabinet officials, they're all mentioned here. But the most shocking revelation came in a thick folder marked Survey Reports, Confidential. These weren't the official geological surveys that had been filed with the territorial government. These were secret assessments conducted by mining engineers who had discovered something extraordinary beneath Cedar Ridge. The Apache Reservation didn't just sit atop silver deposits. It contained one of the largest untapped veins of precious metals in North America. Gold, silver, copper, and rare minerals worth millions of dollars lay beneath land that had been guaranteed to the Apache people by federal treaty. The massacre wasn't just about local greed, Davidson realized, his voice filled with growing outrage. This was a coordinated effort by powerful interests to steal a geological treasure trove worth more money than most people could imagine in a lifetime. Among the documents was a detailed timeline showing how the conspiracy had been planned and executed. Government surveyors had discovered the mineral deposits 3 years before the massacre, but had been ordered to keep their findings secret while political and business interests maneuvered to find a way to legally claim the land. When legal methods proved insufficient, they had resorted to manufacturing a conflict that would justify military intervention and force removal of the Apache population. The deaths of Catherine Mitchell, Joseph Crow Wing, and Lieutenant Morrison had been necessary to protect a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of American government and business. But Storm's discoveries weren't finished. The dog led them to one final cache, this one buried beneath the floorboards of the courthouse's main courtroom itself. Here they found something that would ensure justice could never be denied: photographic evidence. The photographs were disturbing in their clarity and detail. They showed the massacre site immediately after the killings, with clear images of the victims and the men who had murdered them. More importantly, they showed government officials and business leaders present at the scene, documenting their direct involvement in the conspiracy. One photograph in particular made Davidson's blood run cold. It showed a group of well-dressed, Men in expensive suits standing over the bodies of the massacre victims and shaking hands as if they had just completed a successful business transaction. Among them, clearly recognizable despite the passage of 15 years, was the current territorial governor. "God in heaven," Davidson whispered, studying the image with trembling hands. Governor Whitmore was there. He was part of this from the beginning. The implications were staggering. The highest-ranking official in Arizona Territory had been directly involved in mass murder for financial gain. But more troubling still was what this revelation meant for the investigation itself. If Whitmore was involved, then federal officials in Washington might be compromised as well. Doc Mitchell picked up another photograph, this one showing the hastily constructed graves where the victims had been buried. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a detail in the background. "That's not just any dog watching the burial. In the shadows at the edge of the photograph, barely visible but unmistakable to those who knew what to look for, was the figure of a large dog with distinctive markings. Thunderwalker had been there, had witnessed everything, and had somehow managed to preserve the memory of these events for 15 years until someone worthy of his trust could help him reveal the truth. But the most devastating document in the cache was a detailed financial ledger showing how the profits from the illegal mining operation had been distributed. The amounts were staggering. Millions of dollars had been extracted from Apache land and distributed among conspirators ranging from local officials to members of Congress. Sheriff Garrett, despite his central role in the conspiracy, had been relatively small fish in a very large pond. The real masterminds were men whose names were known throughout the territory and beyond: judges, senators, railroad barons, and mining magnates who had used their positions of power to orchestrate theft on a massive scale. "This changes everything," Davidson said, his face grim with the weight of what they had discovered. "We're not just dealing with local corruption anymore. This is treason, conspiracy against the United States government, and genocide against the Apache people." As they studied the evidence, a disturbing pattern emerged. The Apache reservation in Cedar Ridge hadn't been the only target. Similar operations had been conducted across the Southwest, each following the same template: secret mineral surveys, manufactured conflicts, mass killings disguised as military actions, and the systematic theft of Native American lands. The scope of the conspiracy was so vast that it called into question the legitimacy of territorial authority itself. How many officials could be trusted when the corruption reached so high and spread so wide? But Storm's mission was nearly complete. As they gathered the final pieces of evidence, the dog's behavior began to change. The restless energy that had driven him to dig and search was gradually being replaced by something that looked remarkably like peace. The turquoise pendant around his neck seemed to glow with inner light, and his amber eyes held a satisfaction that spoke of justice finally within reach. Thunderwalker had waited 15 years for this moment, and now the truth was fully revealed. However, their celebration was premature. As Marshal Davidson prepared to send word of their discoveries to federal authorities in Washington, a telegram arrived that changed everything once again. Governor Whitmore was already en route to Cedar Ridge with a full company of territorial militia, officially to investigate reports of civil unrest, but actually, Davidson realized, to destroy the evidence and eliminate anyone who had seen it. The final confrontation was approaching, and this time it wouldn't be fought just against local corruption, but against the full power of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. Storm had revealed the truth, but ensuring that justice was served would require courage from everyone who had seen the evidence and understood its implications. The real battle for the soul of Cedar Ridge was about to begin. Governor Whitmore arrived in Cedar Ridge like a storm sweeping across the desert, bringing with him 50 armed militiamen and an authority that seemed absolute. His official proclamation declared the town under territorial martial law due to Apache uprising and civil disorder. giving him sweeping powers to arrest, detain, and suppress any opposition to his will. But Marshal Davidson was ready for him. In the 3 days since discovering the photographic evidence, the federal officer had worked tirelessly to prepare for this confrontation. He had sent copies of the most damning documents to multiple federal agencies in Washington, ensuring that the evidence would survive even if the originals were destroyed. More importantly, he had rallied the honest citizens of Cedar Ridge to stand together against the corruption that had poisoned their community for 15 years. The town had divided into 2 clear camps. On one side stood those who supported the governor's authority and wanted to maintain the profitable status quo, regardless of the moral cost. On the other stood a growing coalition of citizens who had seen the evidence of genocide and theft and refused to remain silent any longer. Doc Mitchell had emerged as an unexpected leader among those demanding justice. The gentle physician had found steel in his spine when confronted with proof of his sister's murder, and his medical authority lent weight to his moral arguments. "We've lived with blood money for 15 years, he told a crowd gathered in the church on the night before. Whitmore's arrival. Every prosperous day this town has known since the massacre was bought with the lives of innocent people. We can't undo what was done, but we can make sure it never happens again." Mrs. Henderson, her conscience finally clear after revealing the hidden records, had become one of the most vocal supporters of federal investigation. "I lost 15 years of sleep knowing what my husband had hidden," she said, her voice strong, despite her tears. "I won't lose another night knowing we failed to seek justice for those who died." Even some of the Apache community, led by Chief I, Standing Bear, had cautiously aligned themselves with the federal authorities. The old chief understood the risks of taking sides in a white man's conflict, but he also recognized that this might be their only chance to see justice served for the massacre of their people. "For too long, we have kept silent to preserve peace," he told his gathered tribesmen. "But peace built on buried truth is no peace at all. It is simply delayed justice, and the delay has gone on long enough." Young Aiyana found herself at the center of these preparations, her role as Storm's human companion making her a crucial witness to everything that had been discovered. At just 8 years old, she possessed evidence that could bring down some of the most powerful men in the territory. Singing Crow had spent hours preparing her granddaughter for what was to come, sharing Apache traditions about courage, truth, and the responsibility that comes with sacred knowledge. "You have been chosen for this purpose, little star," the elderly woman said, as they sat together beneath the cottonwood tree where Storm had made his first discovery. "The spirits of the dead have entrusted you with their story. You must be strong enough to tell it, even when powerful men try to silence you." Storm himself seemed to understand the approaching climax. The dog had grown calmer in recent days, his frantic digging replaced by a steady watchfulness that suggested his revelatory work was complete. But there was something else in his amber eyes now, a warrior's readiness for battle. The ceremonial war shield that Storm had uncovered in the mine had been placed in the church for safekeeping, but its presence seemed to charge the very air around it with spiritual energy. Apache elders who saw it recognized its significance immediately. It had belonged to a great war chief, and its discovery meant that the spirits were preparing for a final confrontation between justice and corruption. Marshal Davidson established his headquarters in the church, turning the sacred space into a fortress of federal law. He positioned his deputies at strategic points throughout the town and made it clear that any attempt to destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses would be met with deadly force. "Governor Whitmore may have territorial authority," Davidson announced to his assembled supporters, "but federal law supersedes territorial law when it comes to crimes against the United States government. And make no mistake, what happened here 15 years ago was an act of war against the United States carried out by traitors wearing American uniforms." The night before the final confrontation, Aiyana experienced something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. She had been unable to sleep, troubled by dreams of the coming conflict, when Storm appeared at her bedside and led her outside into the moonlit desert. There, beneath the star-filled Arizona sky, she witnessed a gathering that seemed to exist between the worlds of the living and the dead. Apache warriors from ages past stood in silent ranks, their spiritual forms shimmering like heat mirages. Among them were the recent victims, Joseph Crow Wing, Catherine Mitchell, and Lieutenant Morrison, but also countless others who had died over the years fighting for justice against overwhelming odds. At the center of this ghostly assembly stood Thunderwalker, Storm's spiritual predecessor, his form more solid and defined than the others. The great dog looked at Aiyana with eyes that held both ancient wisdom and profound gratitude. Without words being spoken, she understood what was happening. The spirits were preparing for the final battle, not as supernatural intervention, but as witnesses to ensure that truth prevailed over lies, that justice overcome corruption, and that the sacrifices of the past were finally honored. When she returned to her bed, Aiyana found her grandmother sitting by the window, as if she too had witnessed the spiritual gathering. "They are ready," Singing Crow said simply. "Tomorrow, the living and the dead will stand together for justice." The morning of confrontation dawned clear and bright, the desert air crisp with the promise of momentous events. Governor Whitmore rode into Cedar Ridge at the head of his militia, in column, his bearing that of a man accustomed to having his will obeyed without question. He was the imposing figure, tall, well-dressed, with the bearing of someone born to command. But those who looked closely could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned for threats, the telltale signs of a man who knew his crimes were catching up with him. Whitmore's first act was to demand that all federal agents leave the town immediately, claiming that their presence was inflaming tensions and threatening territorial security. When Marshal Davidson refused, the governor ordered his militia to surround the church and demand surrender of all evidence related to the investigation. "You are interfering with legitimate territorial authority," Whitmore declared, his voice carrying the weight of official power. "I order you to cease this investigation immediately and turn over all documents and photographs to territorial custody." Davidson's response was calm but unyielding. "Governor, you are named as a direct participant in the crimes under investigation. You have no authority to order the cessation of a federal investigation into your own criminal activities." The standoff escalated quickly as more townspeople gathered to witness the confrontation. Those supporting the federal investigation positioned themselves near the church, while Whitmore's supporters rallied around the militia positions. It was then that Storm made his final contribution to the cause of justice. The dog walked calmly to the center of the town square, directly between the opposing forces, and began to dig one last time. What he uncovered stunned everyone present. A time capsule that had been buried by Lieutenant Morrison before his death, containing not just documents, but also a detailed map showing the locations of mass graves throughout the territory. The young cavalry officer had suspected he might be killed for his knowledge, and had taken precautions to ensure the truth would eventually be revealed. The map showed dozens of burial sites, each marking a place where Native Americans had been murdered to facilitate illegal land seizures. The scope of genocide revealed by Morrison's final testament was so vast that even some of Whitmore's supporters began to question their allegiance. But the governor was beyond such considerations. Faced with evidence that would certainly lead to his execution for treason and mass murder, Whitmore made a desperate decision. He ordered his militia to attack the church, intending to kill everyone who had seen the evidence and then blame the massacre on an Apache uprising. As his militiamen raised their weapons, the final battle for the soul of Cedar Ridge was about to begin. With an 8-year-old Apache girl and her supernatural canine companion standing at the center of a conflict, that would determine whether justice or corruption would ultimately prevail. The moment Governor Whitmore gave the order to attack, something extraordinary happened that none of the assembled militiamen had expected. Storm stepped forward into the center of the square, and around his neck, the ancient turquoise pendant began to emit a soft, ethereal light that grew brighter with each passing second. The sacred eagle feather that had been discovered with Lieutenant Morrison's remains, now held reverently in Chief Standing Bear's weathered hands, began to move in a wind that no one else could feel. As it did, the temperature in the town square dropped dramatically, and the very air seemed to shimmer with unseen presence. Aiyana felt the change immediately. The connection she had developed with Storm over the weeks of their partnership deepened into something far more profound, a spiritual bridge that allowed her to serve as a conduit between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Through Storm's amber eyes, she could see them clearly now, the spirits of those who had been murdered 15 years ago, standing in silent testimony to the truth that was finally being revealed. Joseph Crow Wing stood tall and proud in his traditional Apache dress, his presence radiating the strength and wisdom that had made him a respected leader among his people. Beside him, Catherine Mitchell appeared exactly as she had been in life, young, beautiful, and filled with the compassion that had led her to risk everything for justice. Her gentle smile held no anger toward those who had killed her, only sadness for the years of suffering her death had caused. And there was Lieutenant William Morrison, resplendent in his cavalry uniform, his young face bearing the noble expression of someone who had died for principles rather than personal gain. Around them gathered dozens of other spirits, Apache men, women, and children who had been murdered in the systematic campaign of genocide that the conspiracy had orchestrated. The militiamen began to lower their weapons, their courage failing, as they witnessed manifestations that challenged everything they thought they knew about life and death. Some crossed themselves and muttered prayers, while others simply stared in awe at the spiritual assembly that had materialized before their eyes. But Governor Whitmore was beyond such considerations. His face twisted with rage and desperation. He drew his own pistol and aimed it directly at Aiyana. "This ends now," he screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I will not be destroyed by the fantasies of a savage child and her mongrel dog." The spirits reacted immediately to the threat against their chosen witness. Joseph Crow Wing stepped forward, his ghostly form becoming more solid and defined as he positioned himself between Whitmore and Aiyana. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 15 years of patient waiting for justice. "Thomas Whitmore," he said, each word resonating with supernatural authority, "you have been called to account for the blood you have spilled and the lies you have told. The earth itself bears witness against you." The governor's response was to fire his pistol directly at the spirit, but the bullet passed harmlessly through Joseph's form and embedded itself in the church wall behind him. The Apache leader's expression didn't change, but his presence seemed to grow even more powerful. Catherine Mitchell stepped forward next, her gentle voice carrying infinite sadness as she addressed the man who had ordered her death. "I forgave you years ago, Thomas, but forgiveness does not erase justice. The truth I died protecting has finally been revealed, and no amount of violence can bury it again." Lieutenant Morrison was the last to speak, his young voice strong with military bearing and moral certainty. "Governor, as an officer of the United States Army, I hereby place you under arrest for treason, murder, and conspiracy against the government you swore to serve. Your crimes have been witnessed, documented, and will not be forgotten." The spiritual testimony was overwhelming in its power and moral authority. Even Governor Whitmore's most loyal supporters began to back away, their faith in his leadership shattered by the supernatural confrontation they were witnessing. Marshal Davidson seized the moment, stepping forward with his federal badge clearly visible. "Thomas Whitmore, by the authority vested in me by the United States government, you are under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and treason against the United States of America. But Whitmore was beyond rational thought now. Cornered and desperate, he turned his weapon toward the crowd of innocent townspeople who had gathered to witness the confrontation. "If I'm going down, I'm taking as many of you with me as possible," he screamed, his finger tightening on the trigger. It was Storm who acted to save them all. The dog launched himself through the air with supernatural speed and power, his form seeming to merge momentarily with the spirit of Thunderwalker as he struck the governor's arm just as the pistol fired. The shot went wide, harmless, but the impact sent Whitmore sprawling to the ground. As he fell, something remarkable happened. The spiritual forms of the massacre victims became visible to everyone present. Not just to Aiyana and those with the gift of spiritual sight. The entire town square filled with ghostly figures, each one bearing witness to the crimes that had been committed against them. The sight was both beautiful and terrible, a manifestation of justice that transcended the boundaries between life and death. Chief Standing Bear raised the sacred eagle feather high above his head, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone speaking for all the victims of the conspiracy. "Spirits of the murdered, your testimony has been heard. Justice is finally within reach. Rest now, knowing that truth has triumphed over lies and that your sacrifices were not in vain." The ghostly assembly began to fade, but not before each spirit turned toward Aiyana and Storm with expressions of profound gratitude. They had waited 15 years for this moment, and now, through the courage of a young Apache girl and her remarkable canine companion, their deaths would finally be avenged. As the spirits began to fade from view, Chief Standing Bear produced the final ceremonial artifact that would seal their spiritual resolution, a sacred peace pipe that had belonged to Joseph Crow Wing himself. The pipe had been discovered among the medicine man's personal effects in the hidden chamber beneath the mine, and its presence now seemed to fill the air with ancient power. The elderly chief began the traditional ceremony for honoring the dead and ensuring their peaceful passage to the spirit world. As he lit the pipe with reverent care, smoke began to rise. Not ordinary smoke, but something that seemed to shimmer with otherworldly light. Governor Whitmore, still sprawled on the ground where Storm had knocked him, watched in growing terror as the ceremony proceeded. The full weight of his crimes was finally pressing down upon him, and the spiritual manifestations he had witnessed had shattered his ability to deny the reality of divine justice. "This isn't possible," he whispered, his voice breaking with fear. "They're dead. I made sure they were dead." Marshal Davidson stood over the fallen governor, his expression stern but not without compassion. "Thomas Whitmore, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." But Whitmore was beyond caring about legal proceedings. The psychological impact of confronting the spirits of his victims had broken something fundamental in his mind. He began to confess, the words pouring out of him like water from a broken dam. "I never meant for it to go so far," he said, his voice hollow with despair. "It was just supposed to be about the land, about the minerals." But Catherine Mitchell wouldn't stop asking questions, and that Apache medicine man was helping her dig up documents that would have exposed everything. The confession continued, each word confirming what the evidence had already revealed, but adding details that only the primary conspirator could provide. Whitmore named names, revealed the full extent of the conspiracy, and provided information about other similar operations throughout the territory. As he spoke, the sacred smoke from the peace pipe continued to rise, carrying with it the final prayers for the murdered victims. One by one, the ghostly figures began their departure from the mortal world, their spiritual business finally concluded. Joseph Crow Wing was the last to fade. But before he departed, he approached Aiyana one final time. Though he spoke no words aloud, she heard his message clearly in her heart, a blessing of gratitude and a promise that her courage would be remembered among the Apache people for generations to come. Storm sat quietly beside her throughout the ceremony, his amber eyes reflecting a peace that had been absent since the day she had found him dying beneath the cottonwood tree. The turquoise pendant around his neck had stopped glowing, but it remained visible, a permanent reminder of the spiritual connection that had made justice possible. When Chief Standing Bear completed the peace pipe ceremony, the transformation in the town square was immediately apparent. The oppressive weight that had hung over Cedar Ridge for 15 years seemed to lift, replaced by something that felt like hope. The air itself seemed cleaner, fresher, as if a spiritual poison had finally been purged from the community. The militia soldiers, released from their oath of obedience to a corrupt governor, began laying down their weapons and surrendering to federal authority. Many of them had been conscripted unwillingly into Whitmore's scheme, and they seemed almost grateful to finally escape from his influence. Mrs. Henderson approached Aiyana with tears streaming down her cheeks. "Child," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "you've given us all a gift we didn't deserve. You've shown us that truth and courage can triumph over even the most powerful lies." Doc Mitchell, his medical bag forgotten in the intensity of the moment, knelt beside his fellow townspeople who had been affected by the spiritual manifestations. Some were weeping, some were praying, but all of them seemed to be experiencing a profound sense of spiritual cleansing. "It's over," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "After 15 years of carrying this guilt, it's finally over." As the ceremonial smoke dispersed into the clear desert air, the spirits completed their departure from the mortal world. But their final act was to bestow a blessing upon the community that had finally found the courage to seek justice on their behalf. Storm rose to his feet and walked slowly to the center of the square, where the sacred artifacts lay arranged in a pattern that seemed to pulse with residual spiritual energy. He stood there for a long moment, his head raised toward the sky, as if receiving final instructions from Thunderwalker's departing spirit. Then, in a gesture that brought tears to every eye present, Storm picked up the eagle feather in his mouth and carried it to Aiyana, laying it gently at her feet. The symbolism was clear. The spiritual mission was complete, justice had been served, and the bridge between worlds that she had provided was no longer needed. But the bond between girl and dog, forged in compassion and strengthened through shared purpose, would endure long after the supernatural elements faded from their daily lives. They had accomplished something remarkable together, something that would echo through the generations and ensure that the victims of the Cedar Ridge massacre would never be forgotten again. 6 months later, Cedar Ridge had become a very different place. The transformation wasn't just physical, though the town had indeed changed. New buildings rose where old corruption had been torn down, and the once secret silver mine now operated as a legitimate enterprise, with profits shared fairly between the territorial government and the Apache Nation as compensation for decades of theft. But the deeper change was spiritual, woven into the very fabric of the community's daily life. The memorial stone that Aiyana had designed and carved herself stood in the town square where the final confrontation had taken place. Made from local red sandstone and inscribed with words in both English and Apache, it bore a simple but powerful message. In memory of those who died seeking justice, Joseph Crow Wing, Catherine Mitchell, Lieutenant William Morrison, and the many others whose names were lost but whose spirits are not forgotten. Their courage lives on in all who choose truth over comfort, justice over profit, and compassion over indifference. Aiyana, now 9 years old, had grown in ways that went far beyond her additional months of age. The shy, quiet child who had rescued a dying dog beneath a cottonwood tree had become a bridge builder in her community, respected by both Apache and settler families for her wisdom and moral courage. She spent her mornings in the new schoolhouse, that had been built to serve all the children of Cedar Ridge, regardless of their heritage. The teacher, Miss Sarah Williams, had come from back east specifically to establish an integrated school, something that would have been unthinkable before the events that had shaken the town to its foundations. Aiyana has a gift for bringing people together, Miss Williams often told visitors. She sees past the differences that divide us and focuses on the common humanity that unites us all. In the afternoons, Aiyana could usually be found with her grandmother, learning the traditional Apache ways that Singing Crow was determined to preserve for future generations. But now, their lessons were attended by children from throughout the community, as parents recognized the value of understanding the culture and wisdom of their Apache neighbors. Storm remained her constant companion, though his role had evolved. From supernatural messenger to beloved family pet and town mascot, the dog had grown sleek and healthy, his coat now lustrous and his amber eyes bright with contentment. The turquoise pendant still hung around his neck, but it no longer glowed with otherworldly light. Its spiritual purpose fulfilled, it had become simply a beautiful reminder of the extraordinary journey they had shared. Doc Mitchell had established a new medical practice that served both communities without discrimination, and his waiting room was always full of patients who trusted his skill and appreciated his compassion. The discovery of his sister's remains and the resolution of her murder had lifted a weight from his shoulders that he had carried for 15 years. Healing isn't just about treating injuries and illness, he told his new assistant, a young Apache woman who had shown remarkable aptitude for medicine. Sometimes it's about helping entire communities recover from wounds that go much deeper than the physical. The federal investigation triggered by Storm's discoveries had indeed reached into the highest levels of government, just as Marshal Davidson had predicted. Governor Whitmore's trial had exposed a network of corruption that extended far beyond Arizona territory, leading to the resignation of senators, the imprisonment of business leaders, and a complete restructuring of federal policies regarding Native American lands. More importantly, the precedent established in Cedar Ridge had begun to spread throughout the Southwest. Other communities were coming forward with their own buried secrets, and federal investigators were working to address decades of systematic theft and violence against Native American populations. Chief Standing Bear had become an unofficial ambassador between the Apache Nation and the federal government, his dignity and wisdom earning respect from officials who had previously dismissed Native American concerns. The reparations negotiated as a result of the Cedar Ridge investigation had provided his people with resources to build schools, hospitals, and other infrastructure that would serve future generations. Justice delayed is not justice denied, he often said when speaking to other tribal leaders. Sometimes the spirits must wait for the right moment and the right messenger to ensure that truth finally prevails. Mrs. Henderson had transformed her general store into a cultural center that celebrated both Apache and settler heritage, selling traditional crafts alongside modern goods and hosting community events that brought people together across cultural boundaries. Her journey from silent complicity to active reconciliation had inspired others to examine their own roles in perpetuating injustice. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in the children of Cedar Ridge. Apache and settler children played together in the streets, learned from each other's traditions, and grew up with an understanding of diversity and cooperation that their parents' generation had never possessed. On quiet evenings, Aiyana and Storm would often return to the cottonwood tree where their extraordinary adventure had begun. The ancient tree stood unchanged, its massive branches still reaching toward the heavens, but the energy around it felt different now, peaceful rather than restless, blessed rather than haunted. Sometimes when the light was just right and the desert wind whispered through the cottonwood leaves, Aiyana thought she could glimpse them briefly, the spirits of those who had found peace through her courage and Storm's supernatural guidance. They appeared not as troubled ghosts seeking justice, but as benevolent ancestors watching over a community that had finally learned to honor both its living and its dead. The bond between Aiyana and Storm had evolved too, from desperate rescue to spiritual partnership to deep, abiding friendship. They understood each other in ways that transcended the normal relationship between human and animal. Partners who had shared a sacred mission and emerged transformed by the experience. As they sat together beneath the cottonwood tree on this particular evening, watching the sun paint the desert sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Aiyana reflected on the lessons she had learned. Kindness had consequences that rippled far beyond the initial act. Truth, no matter how deeply buried, would eventually surface. And sometimes the smallest acts of compassion could change the world in ways that seemed impossible to imagine. Storm stretched contentedly beside her, his amber eyes reflecting the dying light of day. Round his neck, the turquoise pendant caught the last rays of sun, a beautiful reminder that some bonds transcend the boundaries between life and death, between human and animal, between past and present. The memorial stone in the town square bore witness to tragedy transformed into triumph, but the real memorial was the community itself, healed, united, and committed to ensuring that the sacrifices of the past would never be forgotten, and the mistakes of history would never be repeated.